Today we're going to continue talking about traditional subsistence activities living on the land, part 2, here in Tikadnu, or Cook Inlet, specifically focusing on fishing and hunting. And it's a really critical, important topic to talk about for a lot of different reasons. One of those reasons is that I sincerely believe, as I think a lot of people do, that by learning about the food practices, the traditional ways of sustainably obtaining food of diverse cultures, we can say something meaningful about the food issues that we face today. We face a world where we need to figure out how to sustainably feed about 8 billion people. It's likely going to climb to 10 billion people. And so far, we've actually done surprisingly well at that, in large part due to some of the changes in agricultural technology in the 20th century. So as a result of that, we've been able to sharply increase how much food we grow in the world, including by acre, and as a result, been able to keep up with global population, which is just fantastic. And in some cases, such as in the United States, we've even been able to, I wouldn't say minimize the environmental impact, but minimize it on scale, by which I mean make it so that we can get the same amount of food or more amount of food by applying not a ton more fertilizer, not a ton more, or producing a ton more pollution. And so there's definitely good news in the world of food sustainability. There's also plenty of bad news. And so we could talk about, for example, the concerns with the fact that about half of the habitable land in the world is being used for human food production in one form or another. We could talk about sort of the environmental impacts that can come when we do the sort of more factory farming, as it's sometimes sort of known in slang, approaches to raising food animals, such as having animals in very, very confined condition. We could talk about bee colony collapse disorder, which is a concern and makes farming more expensive because bees are used for pollinating for some kinds of crops. And some scientists believe, this is by no means a for sure thing at this point, but some scientists believe that neonicotinoids and fungicides, so basically pesticides and fungicides, have contributed to that decline. And then we could talk about as well things like the dead zone, quote unquote, the hypoxic areas of places like the Gulf of Mexico, where you have just too much nutrients and pollution going into the water. A lot of things contribute to that. Agriculture is one of them. So we could talk about the pretty significant impacts on the Amazon rainforest by the sort of approach to cattle raising in the Amazon rainforest, where you get huge parts of the forest cut down and then run cattle on it, which is not the most sustainable way to use that land. And so we're doing a balancing act here, and it's an important balancing act, and so far we've been able to keep on track with population growth, which is awesome, but we also need to do that and also be thinking really conscientiously, though, about what kind of an impact are we leaving on the landscape, what kind of a legacy are we leaving for our kids. And so with that in mind, we need to think critically about food sustainability issues, and I think there are worse ways to go about that than examining the past and knowing our history. And that applies both to sort of food growing, but also food collecting, right? So here in Alaska, of course, gathering wild food continues to be a really important part of our economy and of how people put food on their table. It's a pretty significant part of our meat consumption in our home. Salmon, I suspect for a lot of you it is as well. If you look at the numbers of, let's say, for example, king salmon runs, and as in this graph, this is Fish and Game numbers from the state, this is sort of calculating according to a quote-unquote average or baseline run. You'll see that the last, sort of decade and a half, been a hard time for salmon runs here in Alaska. If we look across the state, I'm not talking about any specific river or watershed, but across the state for king salmon. I'm not sure what the most recent data is, but it's not great news. So when we approach these kinds of issues, then we need to be thinking about the past, because there are people living here in Tikadnu and Cook Inlet for, depending where you're at, 4,000 years, 8,000 years, depending on what part of the land we're talking about. Probably a lot longer than that, of course. I'm talking about ones that we have really good archaeological data for. And 10,000 years, and folks that were very often using salmon, and many of whom were able to use it sustainably for centuries, harvest salmon sustainably for centuries. And yet at the same time, we have examples of cultural traditions that have seemed to have had to shift or change or leave the area, perhaps in response to environmental conditions. And so we need to be thinking about these issues and looking to the past and looking at what worked, right? What worked for cultures for centuries, if not millennia, and does that have any lessons to how we think about salmon and salmon management today? So that's a bit of a spiel, I think, for why subsistence matters as a topic, why living on the land matters as a topic. It's also just the most direct way in which people relate to their physical world in a very real sense. Other than the air you breathe, the food and water that you take in, it's about as fundamental as it gets. And so there's worse topics to spend some time thinking about when it comes to a culture. In fact, I think it really helps us connect to our place. I think it really helps us to understand our place by looking at how people have used this land for centuries. Helps us better appreciate the land and better appreciate the subsistence strategies that have been used on this land. What do I mean by subsistence strategies? Subsistence is a bit of a tricky word. Here in Alaska, subsistence has a very specific sort of legal meaning as well as a more popular meaning in reference to certain kinds of hunting limits or fishing limits. That's not what anthropologists necessarily mean by subsistence. We mean that, but also something much bigger. When we talk about a subsistence strategy, we're talking about the sort of 5 main different ways that human beings over the past thousands and thousands of years have come up with for gaining the food that they need. And those 5 strategies are foraging, aka hunting, fishing, gathering, pastoralism, aka herded animals, horticulture, aka small gardens, intensive agriculture, aka larger monocrop kind of situations, and then industrial agriculture, which is where we get most of our food nowadays, even up here in most, or at least in the south central part of Alaska where I live. And so kind of 5 basic techniques, and a lot of societies kind of mix and match in one way or the other. The group that we'll be mainly focusing on today, the Dena'ina, traditionally prior to colonialism, it was almost entirely foraging. I would say entirely foraging. We're going to talk about one kind of interesting practice of raising wild-caught birds, but that still isn't really pastoralism in the classic sense. So it's really foraging, all of it. And so we'll be talking about that. And again, just as another point for why subsistence strategies matter, some have argued that looking at a culture's subsistence strategy really matters because it tells us many other aspects of how a culture will develop. In fact, there's a whole theory along that lines called cultural ecology. It's an old theory from back in the 30s, but still a pretty solid one, I think. In some ways, it's not perfect, and it's got plenty of situations where it doesn't apply. But Julian Stewart, this guy on the right, did a lot of work with I think it was go shoot people. At the time he was calling them, quote, Western Shoshonean. That's not the terminology we typically use now. We'd use more precise terminology such as go shoot, depending on the group we're talking about. But anyways, he did field work in the Great Basin of the United States and developed this theory of cultural ecology. And basically the idea that if you look at there's this kind of culture core, there's this kind of, if we look at how culture gets food from its environment using its available technology, that can then tell us a bunch of other stuff. It can tend to predict other things, and those things might have reverberations into still other things. So we're not shocked, for example, when Nuer people in Eastern Africa traditionally were organized along the lines of sort of a migratory group, a nomadic group, with kind of a situation with elders that were able to tell the different lineages how to manage the different lands, because that's a really good way of managing large herds of cattle and doing it sustainably. And we're also not shocked, even going to the next level of language, to see that so much of Nuer language is very precise in talking about cattle, because cattle matters a great deal. It's a huge chunk of people's food source even to this day. So a lot of this isn't to imply environmental determinism, and I will talk to you at great length about that if you take my environmental anthropology class, Culture and Ecology, Anthe 454. I will talk this issue to death, and it's, we don't want to imply environmental determinism, that the way a society gets its food will tell you everything about a society, because that's just not true. Navajo people and Hopi people in the American Southwest, both are corn farmers. Admittedly, Navajo people are also sheep herders, among other things, but both are corn farmers living in a pretty close area, right, near each other, and you have drastically different languages, religions, very different cultures. There's some environmental reasons for that, but also just a lot of historical reasons, and a lot of other reasons as well, sacred reasons, things to do with one's sacred traditions. So environment's not everything. How people get food out of the environment's not everything, but it sure is something, and it can have a lot of ramifications. It certainly does in our own society, where the fact that we have industrial agriculture, love it or hate it, whatever your feelings about it, it's a very productive form of agriculture. We're able to produce far more food per acre than we would have been able to 500 years ago. And as a result, most people don't have to be involved in farming. And so as a result, we can have, give or take, 4% of our society doing all the food growing. And then the rest of us can be crazy things like this handy dandy little chart like paramedic or janitor or singer or politician, or this should really say police officer, obviously. Anyways, or surgeon, right? All that's made possible by the fact that people aren't having to be directly involved in the food production. And so again, how a society gets its food can tell you a lot about the society. Subsistence matters. Here in Alaska, and specifically in Ticonderoga or Cook Inlet, when we're talking about subsistence, we're really talking about, among other things, salmon fishing, a lot of salmon fishing, as well as a lot of other kinds of fishing and marine animals. It's a life built around this huge waterway of Cook Inlet, as well as the many rivers, such as Kenai River, for example, as well as the various kind of fisheries and lakes and things like Lake Iliamna. It's built around those water sources, and obviously land animals also play a role, and land plants definitely, but a huge part of it is the life that comes to us from the seas. Cornelius Osgood, in his ethnography that you read, and again I want to reiterate that that's an old ethnography, it's back in the 30s, it's got its limitations, but he does say give some helpful information, really useful information about Dena'ina traditional subsistence. He says, we can say without much doubt that fish, and especially salmon, is the most important article of diet for the Dena'ina as a whole. Bit of an understatement, to say the least, when he says that it's a very important part of people's diet. Indeed, many people feel that might have been some people feel that might have been a significant reason that Dena'ina people were able to move into the outer inlet, into places like Anchorage places like Kenai Peninsula, because of a better way of tapping into the salmon resource, right? The ability to do, as I mentioned in the other video, very solid salmon storage pits that would allow for storage of salmon through the winter, which would allow for more healthy, productive life during the winter. Salmon also allowed for this kind of sedentary life. And let me clarify what I mean by that. I don't mean sedentary the way we sometimes use it in our society, in everyday English, where we sometimes use sedentary to indicate that, we don't move around a lot. Like we might say a professor has a kind of sedentary job when especially during COVID, right? When they're sitting in front of their computer and teaching, as do a lot of us. Having said that, that's not what we mean by sedentary when we apply it to the Dena'ina. What instead we're talking about with sedentary, as we've talked about before, is societies that have a firm base of operations. And I should even be more precise than that, because every society has a firm base of operations. Every society has its land. But what I mean more by that is like a village, like some kind of what we would call nowadays a village. And so when you look at the Athabascan groups that are close cultural and language relatives to the Dena'ina, the ones that are more interior, both on this side and on this side of the Alaska-Canada border, let's talk about the Gwich'in, we could talk about the Han. Nowadays, obviously, villages and towns, but traditionally, from what we can tell from the ethnographic record and historic records, more nomadic and seasonal, erecting tents or other kinds of temporary structures and moving along with that, or for Gwich'in society, these kind of tree pole structures that you would then drape skins over. So it wasn't like you'd have to set it up every day, but you could get it down and move it to another place as you needed to, and people would move around for following the caribou herd, following other kinds of seasonal food resources. Then you have groups like the Koyukon. Where and other kinds of groups that we would call kind of semi-sedentary. They might have had some more like log cabins and things like that, but also still a lot of movement around their traditional lands. That's kind of what you tend to think of with northern Athabascan groups. Dena'ina, and to some extent also Ahtna, are really unique in this regard because they have these like really clear, established villages where people clearly spend a lot of the time during the year. And that makes sense as soon as you consider salmon, right? You have this abundant resource because of the way the salmon work, because of the fact that salmon are anadromous. They start up in the rivers and streams, move down out into the ocean, get all big and yummy, just kidding, and then move back up to breed again and die and start the cycle all over again. Because of that predictable or at least traditionally predictable, yearly return of salmon, those groups who were positioned close to the mouth of the water where you would get the most salmon, right when they're coming from the sea into the waterways, traditionally had a huge abundant source of protein coming to them. And if you could use that well, gosh, that changes everything. And it did certainly for ancestral Dena'ina people, where it allowed for these settled villages, right, where you'd have, let's say, 5 or 10 or large multifamily homes that could kind of stay in one area. It's not to say that Dena'ina people historically weren't moving around in their territory like a lot of groups. Most groups, people would move to things like fish camps, definitely, 100%. Go there during the summer, catch extra fish in a favorite fishing hole. People would go on, temporary hunting expeditions, things like that. But you had a really clear village kind of base of operations, and that was allowed for by salmon. So salmon change everything. And indeed, that's part of a bigger, broader trend that we see in regards to subsistence. So back in the day, there's a guy named Almond Service. He was an anthropologist. You don't need to remember that name. But he developed this framework for thinking about how groups of people get their food and the huge effects it has on their society. And he said, okay, so we've got 5 subsistence strategies. Well, and then we've also, kind of like 4 is what he was focusing on. Foraging, pastoralism, horticulture, agriculture. Why can I remember agriculture? Anyways, but he also, so that was something that anthropologists have been talking about. He talked about, okay, well, we've got kind of 4 levels of, or types of social order. 4 types of ways that a society can kind of be arranged. Bands, which are these kind of extended family groups, typically of like 25 to 40, as well as kind of allies and stuff like that, typically tend to be very egalitarian, not a really firm like leader, or there will be a leader, but the leader has kind of just like a few different roles and not a ton of power and can't really enforce their will and stuff like that. And it's a pretty small group and people can break away pretty easily and stuff like that. You have these bands, and they tend to be mobile. And then you had chiefdoms, as well as tribes, which are kind of larger types of groups, right? Tribes can involve hundreds to thousands of groups that have lumped together, oftentimes smaller bands that have kind of lumped together into a big alliance based on cultural or language grounds. You have chiefdoms, which, as the name implies, you have kind of a much more formal leadership structure, oftentimes, but not always inherited, and then who's able to kind of redistribute and move resources around, may even have some kind of punishing power in the society, although sometimes that's not the case, sometimes it is, and then you usually not, and then you have this state type societies like what we are currently living in pretty much across the world, which is societies where you have a formal government apparatus. My point with all of that is Almond Service developed this idea of these 4 types of social organizations, and then a lot of anthropologists, the way we tend to teach this is that there's a pretty predictable correlation here. When a group is a hunting and gathering band, or hunting and gathering group, they tend to be a band. They tend to be these mobile groups that can break apart easily, or just kind of a few close relatives and families can number in the tens, things like that. As they move towards horticulture and growing food, then they become chiefdoms and get larger and more settled down and build villages. And then if you happen to also have agriculture, then it leads to even larger kinds of things like cities. And that seems like a pretty nice, easy model, and it seems to work most of the time, and we teach it in Anthropology 101. Problem with that model, and you see it a lot here in Alaska, is it doesn't always match up to reality, particularly when we have coastal fishing groups. That's a major exception to the theory. When you look at groups like the Tlingit here in the Pacific Northwest coast, and they're very large villages and complex leadership structures, when you look at groups like the Calusa, who have essentially developed what we would call nowadays a kingdom in southern Florida that was based around fishing, mainly in shellfish. And of course, when you look at groups like the Dena'ina, we see groups that developed settled villages, and in some cases, very clear types of formal leadership without being a horticulture or agriculture kind of group. So it's kind of fascinating and interesting, and tells us that we're dealing with something really interesting when we talk about Dena'ina subsistence. So I'm going to pause the video here.